Thanks so much. Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk about an emerging research area in my lab, which is the impacts of climate change on human-wildlife interactions, which I don't think has gotten enough attention, but I think has really important policy and conservation implications and also implications for human society and human well-being. So I'm going to give a presentation for probably about 15 or 20 minutes, and then I'm hoping that we'll have enough time to have somewhat of a discussion, because I'd really love to hear from folks in the group about where they think that this might have impact, or where to potentially take this research, or whether there are there could be potentially policy outcomes out of this research. So to begin with, what is human-wildlife conflict? Well, human-wildlife conflict can be considered direct interactions between people or our property and wildlife that have negative outcomes. So that can be bears coming into areas and destroying, destroying cars. It could be the vehicle collisions with animals. It could be wolves attacking livestock. It could be people putting out traps for animals to try to reduce their populations so that they won't be coming into human territories. So there's all different types of forms of conflict. And these conflicts, when summarized in total, cost the global economy billions of dollars each year. And I'll give a few examples of the kind of economic costs that result from human-wildlife conflict. But besides economic loss, it can directly threaten human lives. So if we think about animal attacks on people, it can threaten human livelihoods. So when there's conflict between animals and agricultural activities, for example, or attacks on livestock from that are owned by subsistence farmers, it can really be detrimental to people's livelihoods. But it's also a huge threat to biodiversity. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But so first, as an example of some of the economic losses that can come from human-wildlife conflicts, wildlife damage just to 4 crops in the United States, to corn, cotton, soybeans, and wheat, resulted in losses of over $500 million in 2017 alone. Economic losses associated with livestock predation by wild carnivores like lions and leopards in South Africa, just in 1 year, totaled over $170 million. And damages from vehicle collisions with wildlife, and primarily deer in North America, exceed $1 billion annually. So we're not just talking about small losses here. We're talking about globally, negative interactions with wildlife can be extremely economically costly. But also this can happen in reverse, where activities that people take on to reduce this kind of conflict. So for example, if you think about illegal killing of wolves, which is something that happens in Washington State, where I'm currently in, is a huge problem, and conflict, human-wildlife conflict and retaliatory killing of animals is one of the major drivers of decline of many species, and particularly mammals, and especially carnivores. But then we also have unintentional killing. So when we have deer vehicle collisions, very often that results in mortality for the animal that's being collided with. We have whales that are being struck by shipping vessels in the ocean. And so this is a problem for both sides, for both human well-being as well as biodiversity conservation. But what about climate change? So we know that human-caused climate change is driving long-term directional changes in climate. So we're seeing increases in warming in many parts of the planet, but we're also seeing increased variability in climate conditions. So bigger swings, for example, between El Nino and La Nina conditions, as well as increased frequency and severity of acute climate events like hurricanes or droughts, for example. But what hasn't really been looked at is the interaction between climate change and human-wildlife conflict. But we're actually seeing emerging evidence that there's actually a very strong connection between these two. And so if we look at some recent headlines in the news, We'll see, for example, mobs of kangaroos take to streets of Australia's capital over food shortages. And if you actually read the article, you'd know that this occurred during a really historic drought that occurred in 2018. So here we have some major climate event that's being linked to animals coming into more human-dominated areas and creating havoc. Lakes' rising waters bring crocodiles and hippos closer to residents, threatening life, limb, and livelihoods. This was in September 2022, so about a year ago. And this was in parts of Africa. But if you again read the article, the lakes' rising waters was also a result of long-term climate change. When we plant, they come. Thirsty elephants pose new problems for drought-hit Kenyan farmers. And much closer to home, and very recently, just this past September, could Hurricane Ian increase the chances of alligator attacks in South Carolina? So there are some anecdotal news reports that are making a link between either climate events or long-term climate change and changes in the interactions between people and wild animals. And so my lab recently did a systematic literature review where we compiled all published research that had a quantitative empirical link between climate change and human-wildlife conflict. And we looked at the role of acute climate events like droughts or heat waves, the role of interannual variation, so like El Nino, La Nina years, and then long-term climate change, so declines in sea ice or long-term global rises in mean temperatures on the number of instances of conflicts between people and wildlife. And we saw that there has been a lot more documented evidence of these links in recent years. The number of human wildlife conflicts that have been identified as having climate as an underlying driver have quadrupled in the last decade compared to the 3 decades prior. So people are starting to pay more attention to this. And we also found that these instances were globally distributed. They weren't all found in one place on Earth. They were found on 6 continents and in all 5 major oceans. And we also looked at the underlying climate drivers that were underlying those conflicts. And so the colors here correspond to what the climate variable was that the study identified as underlying conflict. So for example, changes in precipitation from climate change, or changes in sea ice, or changes in temperature, or changes in fire regimes, and how that can change the interactions between people and animals. And we do start to see some patterns emerge. So for example, in Southern Africa, we're seeing a lot of conflicts being driven by changes in precipitation, which are in blue. And the circles are acute events. So acute changes in precipitation tend to be droughts. Whereas, for example, in the Arctic, we're seeing a lot more conflicts that are being driven by changes in sea ice at a long-term time scale. And I'll give an example of what that looks like. But then let's look at the outcomes of the conflicts that were identified as being driven by climate change. So of the conflicts that we found, and again, these are published studies, 45% of them cited an outcome that was physical harm to wildlife, 43% cited physical harm to people, and 45% cited loss of food production. And so this is clearly really threatening both people's livelihoods, people's physical safety, as well as the safety and well-being of wild animals as well. And this graph here on the right shows just the different kinds of animals that were involved in conflicts. So elephants were really the number one taxon that was implicated, followed by bears. But we had across the board whales, mosquitoes, some bird species, and the types of conflict outcomes that we saw included revenue loss, property damage, loss of food production, injury and mortality to both people and wildlife. I'm just going to walk through one case study to kind of demonstrate an example. So in the Arctic, we know that long-term climate change has driven long-term declines in sea ice extent. where sea ice freeze up dates. So the date in the spring when, or the date in the fall when sea ice freezes up has gotten later and later in the wintertime. And polar bears rely on that sea ice for successful hunting of marine mammals, which is their primary prey. And this study that I'm about to talk about was done in Hudson Bay in Canada. And so declining sea ice has forced polar bears to spend more time on land and seek out alternative food sources because they are not as able to capture marine mammals in the ocean without that sea ice. And this has led bears to come into towns and forage at garbage dumps and increase the frequency of their interactions with people. So they're spending more time on land and they're switching what they're eating as a result of climate change. This has led to, like I said, increased interactions with people. And then a 2009 study found a very strong correlation between how late this sea ice freeze update was and how many polar bears were captured on land as being, quote, problem animals. So problem animals means that these bears are coming into more contact with people. They are creating nuisances. In some cases, they are physically threatening people. They're foraging at garbage dumps. And because of the problematic behavior of these bears in human-dominated areas, they're being captured and essentially killed or removed from the population as a way of trying to mitigate this conflict. And so as you're getting sea ice freezing up later and later, you're getting more problem bears captured on land. And that's led to a long-term increase as sea ice has declined. Over time, there's been more problem bears on land. And so over a 30-year period between 1970 and 2005, there were the number of human polar bear conflicts tripled in this part of Canada. And even though this study was done over a decade ago in 2009, recent headlines show that this is still a very, very current issue. And so, for example, the Toronto Star had a story in 2022 that landfills and climate change are increasing polar bear conflicts in the Arctic, and they published a report. And then incredibly tragically, many of us may have heard of this mother and her one-year-old son who were recently killed by a polar bear attack in Alaska just a few weeks ago, which the state wildlife agency did make a connection again to climate change and polar bears spending more time on land and leading to these negative outcomes between interactions between people and polar bears. So that's just one example. There are a lot of examples around the world. We have a paper from that literature review that is coming out in Nature Climate Change just within the next few weeks. I'm happy to share it with anyone, where we talk about a lot of different case studies, lions, elephants, wolves, deer, all sorts of different instances in which climate change is changing either the behavior of animals or the behavior of people. That's bringing us into closer contact between people and wildlife and leading to these negative outcomes. So it's really something we need to be paying attention to. Another thing that we are working on is trying to understand into the future, how is the distribution of animals and the distribution of people going to change as a result of climate change. We know that climate change is changing species distributions all across the planet. A lot of species are moving northward, for example, but also it currently is, and it's going to be changing the distributions of people on the planet. People are going to be migrating away from certain coastal areas that are going to be destroyed from sea level rise. Certain areas are becoming less inhabitable because of increased frequency and severity of extreme fires. And so we're seeing a redistribution of both people and wildlife on the planet that's going to change how we overlap with one another. And so this map is, this is very preliminary. These are preliminary results, but I'm working with a postdoctoral fellow right now, Dejong Ma, who is taking global maps of species distributions and projecting those forward into the future, and taking predicted distributions of people under different socioeconomic scenarios and looking at changes in the overlap. And so this is the average change in overlap across all the different scenarios we looked at. And so we are seeing essentially the red areas are where we're seeing increased overlap. And we can see that, for example, the Western US, because of both changes in species distributions and changes in where people are expected to be, we're expecting to see a lot more overlap between people and animals. And then we can also look at how much of the change in future overlap is primarily driven by changes in human populations versus being primarily driven by changes in species. And this map shows basically anything that's kind of pink shows that there's a large change in future projected change in overlap, and anything that's dark blue says that overlap is projected to change primarily because of changes in human populations. And so you can see that a lot of the map here is more on the blue side than the pink side, which means that most of the changes that we're seeing in terms of changes in human wildlife overlap are being driven by projected changes in human populations. I'm going to skip this next slide and go straight towards what can we do about this. So the first thing we can do is by recognizing that climate change is reshaping the relationships and the interactions between people and wildlife, we can start to develop more proactive policies that explicitly take climate change into account. So, for example, one of the conflicts that we talk about in our paper is increased whales becoming entangled in fishing gear that have happened along the West Coast that have been driven by changes in whale distributions as a result of climate change. And so, for example, the state of California has implemented a new, really proactive policy that explicitly looks at what is the climate doing in any given time, what are the oceanographic conditions, is the climate conditions or the oceanographic conditions likely to lead to increased whale entanglements. And then it updates its management of the fishery, of whether the fishery should be open or closed based on the likelihood of risk of whale entanglement. So it's an example of how we can identify that if certain climate conditions, for example, droughts or wildfires, are more connected or more predictive of increased conflict with wildlife, we can then make more proactive policies to try to head off that kind of conflict. Similarly, we can do climate-informed fiscal allocation. So, for example, in some parts of the world where carnivore attacks on livestock is a really big problem, some governments actually provide farmers essentially carnivore offsets. So they have livestock reimbursement programs where they will pay farmers for losses that are due to carnivores, as essentially a way of saying we still value having carnivores on the landscape, but we know that it is putting farmers and their livelihoods at risk. So we're going to compensate them for that. If we know that, for example, that livestock loss is increased during drought periods, which we've shown in our paper, then we can know that these governments should be managing their budgets kind of like a dry day fund, as opposed to a rainy day fund, knowing that in periods where a drought is forecasted, they may be able to use that information to say, okay, we need to allocate more spending, knowing that there's going to be increased human wildlife conflict during this period. We can also be doing more increased outreach and education. So, for example, in the American Southwest, one study found a really strong correlation between the number of black bears coming into human-dominated areas and foraging in people's homes or people's backyards as a function of La Nina years. So in La Nina years tend to be more drought years in the American Southwest. There tends to be less natural food for bears. But by knowing that there's this correlation between human bear interactions during La Nina years, the certain local community organizations have started doing more public outreach to warn people, okay, in these conditions, we're more likely to come into bear. So please be vigilant. Please make sure that you're locking up your houses well, etc. And then finally, thinking about integration of climate adaptation and conflict mitigation policies. So certain climate adaptation policies, like, for example, relocating people because of sea level rise or reforestation efforts, those can actually potentially lead to increased conflict if people are moved into areas where they might come into more contact with wildlife. And so we need to be thinking about how our efforts to mitigate climate change might actually affect our efforts to mitigate conflict with animals and vice versa. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for synergy there. So I'm going to just stop it here and take time for questions. And I just would love to hear people's reactions to this and especially whether you see any kind of application or policy outcomes of this.
All right, I got a question on the floor.
Hi, I'm Joanna Ivantic, live in Maryland, and a friend of mine was in Annapolis at some hearings yesterday and told me about one where the Farm Bureau used to have insurance related to accidents with bears. And now they are saying they are not covering that anymore because they're not considering them accidents. It happens so often. So what they're asking the state to do, they used to have an insurance of something like $5,000, and the state would put $5,000 in for mitigating the damage. Now they're asking for up to $75,000 for farmers to be able to build fences that would be able to keep bears out, mostly in like Montgomery County and the counties closer into Washington, D.C. and the agricultural areas there. So definitely a policy issue that seems to be related to what you're talking about.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear about.
This is also another anecdote, but it ties into a question. I once had a professor who was working on a green infrastructure initiative, and her argument was that when you build subdivisions and you build bulldoze, there you go, these forests, deciduous forests, and then you build houses, well, you're expecting all the animals that live there to relocate, and they're used to being there. And then all of a sudden the residents start complaining, oh, there's still deer in the subdivision, there's raccoons and all that, when really we reduce their habitat. So she was trying to make a network of green infrastructure that was connected as much as possible. So planted trees within these built plans. And it's been a while since I thought about that. I don't know where they are in getting that in regards to policy or even on local level. But do you know of any initiatives that are trying to preserve pockets of habitat in order to reduce these interactions, these negative interactions?
That's really cool to hear about. Let's see. Yeah, in terms of land development, I'm not familiar with any. I can't think of any. I think of there are certainly lots of efforts in place to try to reduce conflict in various ways. For example, like fencing, or putting out, things like having guard dogs for livestock and things like that. But I haven't heard about many efforts in the kind of development and infrastructure context. So that's really cool to hear about.
I would say, on the other hand, with that, I live in Frederick, Maryland, and there's a really lovely park that it goes all the way, basically, it goes all the way up into the watershed. And so there are bears and other animals that come through there. And there was a few years ago, a deer that took that pathway in and then came right to downtown Frederick and saw its face in a glass window and just smashed the window to bits. And so, facilitating that
Mhm.
is, can also have its problems.
Mm.
All right, any questions? I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A just yet. We have about 3 minutes. Okay, well, I guess that is it for us. Thank you so much, Dr. Abrams, and I guess we're going to close up the session.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Have a good one.